What secrets could a quiet old man hide behind his unassuming gaze? The police thought they were dealing with a routine stop, but when federal agents stormed in just 30 minutes later, the truth turned their world upside down. This isn't just a tale of an elderly loner. It's a story of a vow kept and a mission no one could have foreseen. Where are you joining us from? Stick around and subscribe, because tomorrow we've got something extraordinary waiting for you. Rain began to fall as dusk settled over the small town of Caldwell, its streets nearly deserted except for the faint glow of shop signs and the occasional car passing through. The town had a predictable rhythm, the kind where surprises were as rare as a summer storm. That's why the local police didn't bat an eye when they set up a routine DUI checkpoint on the outskirts. John Harrow, a 79-year-old widower, lived in a modest home at the town's edge, a place most folks drove past without a second glance. Known as Old John to the locals, he was a man of few words, always keeping to himself. Most days, you'd find him on his porch, sipping tea, his eyes fixed on the road. His battered Dodge truck, a relic from the 1960s with faded paint and a rattling exhaust, was as much a part of him as his silence. He never drove at night, never strayed far. But that evening, as the sky deepened to a bruised blue and rain streaked the windshield, John eased onto the highway. On the passenger seat sat a small metal case, its latch worn but secure, bound with a leather strap. Every few moments his eyes flicked to it, his face a mask of quiet determination. His hands, weathered and steady, gripped the wheel just a little too tightly. As John approached the checkpoint, the flashing lights cut through the drizzle. The setup was unexpected, a minor inconvenience for most drivers. He slowed, his truck creaking to a stop as a young officer, rain dripping from his cap, waved him over. The officer, barely in his 30s, asked for his license and registration with the practiced ease of routine. John handed them over without a word, his movements slow and deliberate. The officer's gaze lingered on the truck's interior, landing on the metal case. "What's in there?" he asked, his tone casual but curious. John's eyes met his for a moment before he spoke, his voice low and measured. "It's not for you. It's for the Bureau." The words hung in the air, strange and heavy. The officer's brow furrowed. He asked again, sharper this time. John's response was the same, unwavering. Something about his calm refusal sent a ripple of unease through the officer. This wasn't the usual nervous chatter or vague excuse. This was different. The officer signaled to a colleague, and the night took a turn no one could have predicted. The rain drummed harder on the hood of John Harrow's ancient Dodge truck, each drop amplifying the tension at the Caldwell checkpoint. The young officer, now joined by a second, stood under the faint glow of a portable floodlight, their rain-soaked uniforms clinging to their shoulders. The first officer, Officer Daniels, repeated his question about the metal case, his voice edged with suspicion. "Sir, I need you to tell me what's in that case," he said, leaning closer to the open window. John's face remained unreadable, his pale blue eyes fixed somewhere beyond the officer's shoulder. After a long pause, he repeated, "It's for the Bureau, not for you." The words were calm, almost rehearsed, but they carried a weight that made Daniels pause. He exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Reyes, whose hand rested lightly on her radio. Something about John's demeanor, the steady voice, the refusal to elaborate, set their instincts on edge. This wasn't the typical behavior of a man with nothing to hide. Daniels stepped back, motioning for John to step out of the vehicle. "Sir, I'm going to need you to exit the truck," he said, his tone firm but cautious. John didn't argue. He pushed the creaky door open, his boots splashing into a shallow puddle as he stepped into the rain. At 79, his movements were slow but deliberate, his posture straight despite the years etched into his frame. He stood silently beside the truck, hands at his sides, rain streaking down his weathered jacket. Reyes approached, her flashlight sweeping the truck's interior, lingering on the metal case. Its surface was scuffed, the latch old but sturdy, and the leather strap seemed out of place, like something from another era. "Mind if we take a look?" she asked, her voice neutral but probing. John shook his head just once and repeated his earlier statement, this time with a slight edge. "It's for the Bureau. You don't open it." The refusal wasn't hostile, but it was absolute, and it sent a chill through the officers that had nothing to do with the rain-soaked night. By now, a third officer, Sergeant Carter, had arrived, drawn by the low chatter on the radio about an uncooperative driver. He was older, grizzled, with a no-nonsense air earned from years on the force. Carter sized up John, noting the veteran ID tucked in the wallet on the dashboard and the quiet intensity in the old man's eyes. "What's the issue here?" Carter asked, his voice cutting through the patter of rain. Daniels explained quickly. The case, John's cryptic responses, the mention of the Bureau. Carter's eyes narrowed. "The Bureau? As in FBI?" he asked, half expecting clarification. John nodded, just once, his gaze never wavering. The sergeant's jaw tightened. He'd seen his share of strange cases in Caldwell, but an old man claiming ties to federal authorities was new. "Step over here," Carter ordered, guiding John to the side while Daniels and Reyes began a cursory search of the truck's cab. They found nothing unusual, no weapons, no contraband, just a thermos of coffee, a folded map, and the ever-present metal case, which seemed to hum with unspoken importance. The officer's unease grew as John's silence deepened. He wasn't defiant, not in the way they were used to. He didn't argue or plead. He simply stood there, rain dripping from the brim of his cap, watching as they debated what to do. Carter radioed the station, his voice low. "We've got a situation at the checkpoint. Older male, uncooperative, carrying a locked case he says is for the Bureau. Veteran ID, no weapons, but he's not talking. Bringing him in." The dispatcher's response was clipped, asking for details about the case. Carter glanced at it, now resting on the hood of a patrol car, its surface catching the light like a relic from a forgotten time. "Don't know what's in it," he said. "He won't let us touch it." John's eyes followed the case, his expression still unreadable, but his hands flexed slightly at his sides, the first hint of tension breaking through his calm. The decision was made to detain him, at least until they could sort things out. Daniels retrieved a pair of handcuffs, hesitating for a moment as he approached John. "Just procedure," he said almost apologetically. John extended his wrists without protest, the cuffs clicking into place with a dull metallic sound. Carter read him his rights, the words blending into the steady rhythm of the rain. John didn't react, didn't flinch, his gaze locked on the case as Reyes carefully lifted it and placed it in the trunk of a patrol car. The officers worked quickly now, sensing the night slipping into uncharted territory. John was guided to the back of a cruiser, the door closing with a heavy thud. He settled into the seat, his damp clothes leaving faint marks on the upholstery, his face as still as stone. The radio crackled with updates as the convoy prepared to head to the station. "Subject in custody," Daniels reported. "No resistance, but something's off. He's too calm." Inside the patrol car, John stared straight ahead, the world outside blurred by rain-streaked windows. The case was out of sight, secured in another vehicle, but it dominated his thoughts. He hadn't spoken since the cuffs went on, and the officers driving him exchanged uneasy glances in the rearview mirror. "You ever see anything like this?" Reyes asked Carter, her voice barely above a whisper. The sergeant shook his head. "Not in 20 years, he muttered. "Guy's acting like he's been through this before." At the station, the mood shifted as John was led through the side entrance. Officers on duty looked up, curious but distracted, expecting another routine booking. The evidence room buzzed with quiet speculation as the metal case was logged and locked away, marked simply as miscellaneous property. One officer joked it might hold old fishing lures, another wondered if it was stolen goods. None of them grasped the gravity of what they'd stumbled into. But as John was processed, fingerprints taken, photos snapped, paperwork started, a faint alert flickered across the station's computer system, unnoticed at first, hinting that John Harrow was no ordinary man, and the night was far from over. The Caldwell police station hummed with the low buzz of fluorescent lights and the occasional crackle of the radio. But an unfamiliar tension hung in the air as John Harrow was led through the side entrance. The rain had followed him inside, leaving faint trails of water on the linoleum floor from his soaked boots. Officer Daniels, still unsettled by John's eerie calm, guided him to the processing area while Sergeant Carter lingered behind, his eyes flicking toward the evidence room where the metal case now rested. The station was small, built for routine traffic stops and petty disputes, not for mysteries that felt like they belonged in a spy novel. Officers on the night shift glanced up from their paperwork, their curiosity piqued by the sight of old John in handcuffs. To them, he was just the quiet widower who bought coffee and bread at the corner store, not someone who warranted a full escort. Yet as John stood silently, his hands cuffed and his gaze steady, the room seemed to shrink under the weight of his presence. Processing began with mechanical precision. Officer Reyes snapped John's photo, the camera's flash reflecting briefly in his unblinking eyes. His fingerprints were taken, each press of his fingers against the scanner deliberate, as if he were marking the moment. He signed the intake forms where instructed, his handwriting small and precise, offering no resistance, no complaints, just quiet compliance that somehow felt more unsettling than defiance. The officers exchanged glances, their usual banter replaced by hushed murmurs. "He's too calm," Reyes whispered to Daniels as they stepped away to log the paperwork. "Like he knew this was coming." Daniels nodded, his mind replaying John's cryptic words about the Bureau. He'd dealt with drunks, speeders, even the occasional shoplifter, but this was different. John wasn't nervous, wasn't angry. He was waiting. The metal case, now locked in the evidence room, became the unspoken center of the station's growing unease. Officer Torres, a rookie with barely 6 months on the job, was tasked with logging it. He stood before the locker, clipboard in hand, staring at the case's worn surface. Its edges were scuffed, the leather strap frayed but intact, and the latch gleamed faintly under the harsh lights, as if it had been polished by years of careful hands. Torres hesitated before writing miscellaneous personal property on the log, the placeholder term feeling inadequate. "What do you think's in it?" he asked Officer Malone, who was leaning against the doorway sipping coffee. Malone shrugged, half smirking. "Probably his old war medals, or maybe a stash of cash he doesn't trust banks with." Torres forced a laugh, but his eyes lingered on the case. It didn't feel like medals or money. It felt like something that didn't belong in Caldwell. Back in the processing area, Sergeant Carter reviewed John's veteran ID, its edges worn, but the details clear. John Harrow, U.S. Army, honorable discharge, 1968. Nothing unusual, yet Carter's gut told him there was more to the story. He handed a Cheney system. "It looks like your response was cut off. I'll complete the segment you started, continuing the story in the same style, structure, and tone as requested, while increasing the length as per your instructions. I'll ensure it aligns with the previous segments and maintains the mysterious, suspenseful atmosphere, integrating the narrative seamlessly." The Caldwell police station hummed with the low buzz of fluorescent lights and the occasional crackle of the radio, but an unfamiliar tension hung in the air as John Harrow was led through the side entrance. The rain had followed him inside, leaving faint trails of water on the linoleum floor from his soaked boots. Officer Daniels, still unsettled by John's eerie calm, guided him to the processing area while Sergeant Carter lingered behind, his eyes flicking toward the evidence room where the metal case now rested. The station was small, built for routine traffic stops and petty disputes, not for mysteries that felt like they belonged in a spy novel. Officers on the night shift glanced up from their paperwork, their curiosity piqued by the sight of old John in handcuffs. To them, he was just the quiet widower who bought coffee and bread at the corner store, not someone who warranted a full escort. Yet as John stood silently, his hands cuffed and his gaze steady, the room seemed to shrink under the weight of his presence. Processing began with mechanical precision. Officer Reyes snapped John's photo, the camera's flash reflecting briefly in his unblinking eyes. His fingerprints were taken, each press of his fingers against the scanner deliberate, as if he were marking the moment. He signed the intake forms where instructed, his handwriting small and precise, offering no resistance, no complaints, just quiet compliance that somehow felt more unsettling than defiance. The officers exchanged glances, their usual banter replaced by hushed murmurs. "He's too calm," Reyes whispered to Daniels as they stepped away to log the paperwork. "Like he knew this was coming." Daniels nodded, his mind replaying John's cryptic words about the Bureau. He dealt with drunks, speeders, even the occasional shoplifter. But this was different. John wasn't nervous, wasn't angry. He was waiting. The metal case, now locked in the evidence room, became the unspoken center of the station's growing unease. Officer Torres, a rookie with barely 6 months on the job, was tasked with logging it. He stood before the locker, clipboard in hand, staring at the case's worn surface. Its edges were scuffed, the leather strap frayed but intact, and the latch gleamed faintly under the harsh lights, as if it had been polished by years of careful hands. Torres hesitated before writing miscellaneous personal property on the log, the placeholder term feeling inadequate. "What do you think's in it?" he asked Officer Malone, who was leaning against the doorway, sipping coffee. Malone shrugged, half smirking. "Probably his old war medals, or maybe a stash of cash he doesn't trust banks with." Torres forced a laugh, but his eyes lingered on the case. It didn't feel like medals or money. It felt like something that didn't belong in Caldwell. Back in the processing area, Sergeant Carter reviewed John's veteran ID, its edges worn, but the details clear. John Harrow, U.S. Army, honorable discharge, 1968. Nothing unusual, yet Carter's gut told him there was more to the story. He handed the ID back to Reyes and moved to the computer, pulling up the system to run John's details. The screen flickered as it processed, and for a moment, a strange alert flashed across the display. Brief, cryptic, and gone before Carter could read it fully. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, clicking through the system to retrieve it. The screen froze, then loaded a new interface. One Carter had never seen in his 25 years on the force. A single message appeared in bold text. "Secure the individual and item. Stand by for federal response. Do not proceed with questioning." Carter leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. He called Reyes over, pointing at the screen. "You ever see anything like this?" Reyes shook her head, her usual confidence shaken. "That's not our system," she said quietly. "That's something else." The station's rhythm faltered as the message sank in. The officers who had been joking about the case now stood in uneasy silence, their coffee cups forgotten on desks. Carter ordered Torres to double-check the evidence room, ensuring the case was secure. "No one touches it," he said, his voice low but firm. Torres nodded, his earlier curiosity replaced by a nod of apprehension. As he walked down the hall, the station felt colder, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the evidence room. Back in the holding area, John was led to a small room with a metal bench and a single camera in the corner. The door closed with a heavy click, the sound echoing in the quiet. John sat slowly, folding his hands in his lap, his posture straight despite his age. He didn't look at the camera, didn't shift or fidget. He simply waited, his face as unreadable as the rain-slicked night outside. In the main office, the dispatcher, a woman named Clara who'd seen every kind of chaos in her decade at the station, began checking the security cameras more frequently. The federal response mentioned in the message loomed over her thoughts. She'd heard stories of feds sweeping into small towns for drug busts or high-profile arrests, but Caldwell, it didn't add up. She adjusted the camera feed, zooming in on the parking lot where the rain had slowed to a misty drizzle. The orange streetlights reflected on the wet asphalt, casting an eerie glow. Clara's fingers hovered over the radio, ready to alert Carter if anything appeared. Meanwhile, Daniels approached Carter with a question. "Should we offer him water? Food?" Carter hesitated, then nodded. "Check on him, but don't ask anything. You saw the message." Daniels grabbed a bottle of water and walked to the holding room, his steps heavier than usual. He opened the door cautiously, meeting John's steady gaze. "Thought you might need this," Daniels said, placing the bottle on the floor. John nodded once, then returned his eyes to the wall. Daniels closed the door, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't name. The station's phone rang, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet. Clara answered, her voice dropping to a whisper as she listened. She hung up quickly and hurried to Carter, her face pale. "Feds are on their way," she said. "ETA less than 30 minutes. They were notified the second we ran his ID." Carter's jaw tightened. He'd expected a delay, maybe a call for clarification, but this was too fast, too precise. He turned to the room where officers had begun to gather, sensing the shift in the air. "Everyone, stay sharp," he said. "No one goes near the evidence room. No one talks to the detainee. We wait." The officers nodded, their earlier curiosity now replaced by a mix of anticipation and dread. Torres, standing by the coffee machine, felt a chill as he remembered cuffing John at the checkpoint. It had seemed so routine then, an old man with a strange case. Now he wasn't sure what they'd stumbled into. Inside the holding room, John remained still, his hands resting on his knees. The water bottle sat untouched on the floor. Every few minutes, he closed his eyes briefly, as if centering himself, then opened them again, his gaze fixed on the plain wall. The room was cold, the bench hard, but he showed no discomfort. To anyone watching through the camera, he was a statue, a man carved from time and secrets. Yet to John, this moment was the culmination of decades, a plan set in motion long ago, now unfolding exactly as he'd anticipated. The delay didn't bother him. He'd waited years for this night. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped, leaving only a faint mist that clung to the station's windows. The parking lot was empty, but Clara's eyes stayed glued to the camera feed, watching for the first sign of headlights. Carter stood by the hallway, his arms crossed, his mind racing. He'd seen a lot in his career, but this was new. A quiet old man, a locked case, and a federal response that felt like it belonged to a world far bigger than Caldwell. Whatever John Harrow was carrying, it was no ordinary burden, and the truth was closing in fast. The Caldwell police station, once a hub of routine chatter and the clatter of keyboards, had fallen into a hushed stillness, as if holding its breath. The cryptic message on the computer screen, "Secure the individual and item. Stand by for federal response. Do not proceed with questioning," had cast a spell over the room, transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary. Sergeant Carter stood near the front desk, his arms crossed, his weathered face set in a mask of focus. The officers, scattered across the main area, moved with deliberate caution, their usual ease replaced by a quiet vigilance. Officer Daniels, still rattled by John Harrow's unshakable calm, paced near the coffee machine, his eyes darting to the holding room door. Officer Reyes, stationed by the evidence log, flipped through paperwork she'd already read, her fingers restless. The metal case, locked away in the evidence room, seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, its presence looming larger with every passing minute. Outside, the mist had thickened, cloaking the parking lot in a silvery haze, the orange streetlights barely piercing through. The station felt like an island, isolated from the sleepy town beyond, waiting for the storm to break. Inside the holding room, John Harrow sat as he had for the past hour, his hands folded, his back straight against the cold metal bench. The untouched water bottle on the floor reflected the dim light, a small detail in the otherwise stark space. His face remained unreadable, his pale blue eyes fixed on the wall, but there was no trace of impatience or fear. If anything, he seemed at peace, as if this moment, cuffed, confined, and under scrutiny, was exactly where he was meant to be. The camera in the corner recorded his stillness, its feed displayed on a monitor in the main office, where Officer Torres couldn't stop glancing at it. "He hasn't moved," Torres muttered to no one in particular, his voice low. "Not a muscle. It's unnatural." Sergeant Carter overheard but didn't respond. He'd seen his share of stoic suspects, but John was different. His silence wasn't defiance, it was certainty, the kind that came from knowing something the rest of them didn't. The dispatcher, Clara, sat at the front desk, her eyes glued to the security camera feed. She'd adjusted the monitors to cover every angle of the parking lot, her fingers hovering over the radio, ready to alert Carter at the first sign of movement. The federal response was imminent, and the speed of their approach, less than 30 minutes from the moment John's ID was scanned, gnawed at her. Caldwell was a speck on the map, far from the corridors of power. Why would the feds care about an old man and a locked case? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, barely audible over the hum of the station, the low rumble of engines approaching through the mist. Clara leaned closer to the monitor, her breath catching as headlights emerged, cutting through the haze like beacons. "They're here," she called out, her voice sharp enough to snap every head in the room toward her. Carter strode to the desk, his eyes narrowing at the screen. "How many?" he asked. Clara counted quickly. 6 vehicles, SUVs, no markings. No. The parking lot came alive with quiet precision. 6 dark SUVs, identical in their sleek design, rolled into formation, their engines so soft they barely disturbed the night. No sirens, no flashing lights, just a silent, coordinated arrival that felt more like a military operation than a federal visit. The vehicles stopped in unison, their headlights casting long beams across the wet asphalt. Doors opened simultaneously, and figures stepped out, their movements practiced and purposeful. Men and women in dark suits, some with earpieces, others carrying folders or small devices, emerged into the mist. Their faces were serious, their postures rigid, as if they had done this 100 times before. One figure, a woman in her mid-40s, led the group, her dark jacket marked only by a subtle badge clipped to her belt. She carried herself with an air of quiet authority, her eyes scanning the station as she approached the entrance. Behind her, 2 agents flanked her closely, their hands free but ready. The others fanned out, some staying near the vehicles, their gazes sweeping the perimeter. Inside, Carter took a deep breath, his years of experience steadying him. "Everyone, stay professional," he said, his voice low but firm. "No questions, no chatter. Let them do their job." The officers straightened, their earlier unease giving way to a tense readiness. Daniels stopped pacing, Reyes set down her paperwork, and Torres moved to stand near the hallway, his rookie nerves buzzing. The front door opened slowly, the faint creak of its hinges amplifying the silence. The woman stepped inside, her boots clicking on the linoleum, followed by her 2 escorts. She held up a badge, its FBI seal catching the light. "Agent Dana Clark, Federal Bureau of Investigation," she said, her voice clear and measured. She handed her credentials to Carter, who examined them briefly before nodding. "We're here for the individual in custody and the item he was carrying," Clark continued, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every face, every detail. Carter gestured toward the holding area. "He's this way. The case is in evidence." Clark's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of intensity in her gaze, as if the mention of the case confirmed something she'd been expecting. Carter led Clark and her escorts down the hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the quiet. Officers watched from their posts, their curiosity now tinged with awe. Federal agents in Caldwell were as rare as a comet, and the speed of their arrival suggested something far beyond a routine pickup. At the holding room door, Clark paused, peering through the small window. John Harrow looked up, his eyes meeting hers through the glass. For a moment, neither moved, as if sharing a silent understanding. Clark turned to Carter. "I need to speak with him alone," she said. Carter hesitated, then unlocked the door. John stood without being prompted, his movements slow but steady, his cuffs glinting under the fluorescent light. Clark gave him a respectful nod, a gesture that puzzled Carter. She stepped inside and the door closed behind her with a soft thud. The conversation was brief, less than 3 minutes, but the weight of it seemed to ripple through the station. When the door opened again, Clark's expression was unreadable, but her voice was firm. "Release him immediately," she told Carter. "He's not under arrest. He's under federal protection. No further questions, no further procedures." Carter blinked, processing the order. "Understood," he said, motioning for Reyes to remove John's cuffs. Reyes approached cautiously, her hands steady as she unlocked the restraints. John rubbed his wrist briefly, then nodded at her, a small acknowledgement that felt oddly formal. Clark turned to Carter. "The case. I need access to the evidence room." Carter led her to the locker where Officer Torres stood guard, his eyes wide. Clark examined the metal case without touching it, her gloved hands hovering over the latch. She produced a small scanner, its red light flickering as it read the lock. A soft click echoed and the latch sprang open. Clark lifted the lid slowly, revealing a collection of items that seemed to belong to another time. Sealed envelopes, yellowed with age, a flash drive in a padded pouch, faded photographs, their edges creased, and a small black device, rectangular and worn, its serial number barely legible. Clark's eyes narrowed, and she whispered something to one of her escorts who stepped outside to make a call. Carter, standing nearby, caught only fragments of her words. Confirmed, Project Ember Watch, decades. The station's air grew heavier as the reality sank in. Whatever John Harrow had been carrying, it wasn't just personal property. It was a key to something much larger, something that had drawn the FBI to a small-town station in the dead of night. Clark closed the case, sealing it with a new lock, and turned to Carter. "This is classified," she said, her tone leaving no room for questions. "The individual has fulfilled a long-standing obligation. You'll receive a briefing in the coming days, but for now your cooperation is noted." Carter nodded, his mind racing with questions he knew better than to ask. Clark's escort carried the case, and John was led to a private room, where he was offered a towel and a cup of coffee. He accepted the coffee, sipping it slowly, his eyes distant but calm. Outside, the SUVs waited, their engines idling in the mist. The other agents moved with quiet efficiency, preparing to depart. The station, once a place of routine, now felt like the stage for a drama no one fully understood. But John Harrow, the quiet man at its center, had played his part to perfection, and the truth was only beginning to surface. The Caldwell police station, still reeling from the swift arrival of the FBI, seemed to hold its breath as Agent Dana Clark and her team prepared to depart. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, their harsh glow casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. The officers, now gathered in small clusters, spoke in low whispers, their eyes darting between the private room where John Harrow sat and the hallway where the metal case had been secured. The air was thick with questions no one dared to ask, each officer grappling with the realization that their quiet town had become the stage for something far beyond their understanding. Sergeant Carter stood near the evidence room, his arms crossed, his mind replaying every moment of the night. The checkpoint, John's cryptic words, the federal message that had upended their routine. Officer Reyes leaned against a desk, her usual confidence subdued, while Officer Daniels, still shaken, kept glancing at the security monitors, half expecting more SUVs to emerge from the mist. The station felt like a ship adrift, caught in the wake of a storm no one had seen coming. In the private room, John Harrow sat at a small table, the steaming cup of coffee in his hands untouched since his first sip. A towel rested across his shoulders, soaking up the last of the rain from his jacket, but he made no move to dry himself further. His face remained calm, his pale blue eyes fixed on a point beyond the wall, as if seeing something, or someone, from a distant past. The room was plain, with only a chair, a table, and a single overhead light, but John's presence filled it with an unspoken gravity. Officer Torres, tasked with checking on him, lingered at the door, hesitant to intrude. "You need anything else, sir?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. John looked up, his gaze steady but not unkind. He shook his head once, then returned to his silent vigil. Torres stepped back, closing the door gently, his mind racing with the image of the old man, who seemed to carry a lifetime of secrets in his stillness. Back in the main office, Agent Clark convened a brief meeting in the station's conference room, a cramped space usually reserved for shift briefings or the occasional community meeting. She requested Sergeant Carter's presence, along with Officers Reyes and Daniels, who had been at the checkpoint. The rest of the team was instructed to maintain their posts, ensuring no one approached the private room or the evidence area. Clark stood at the head of the table, the sealed metal case now resting before her, guarded by one of her escorts. John was brought in, uncuffed and moving with the same deliberate pace he'd shown all night. He took a seat beside the case, his hands folded, his expression unchanging. The officers sat across from him, their postures stiff, unsure whether they were witnesses or participants in what was unfolding. Clark's voice cut through the silence, measured but commanding. "What you've encountered tonight is not a typical case," she began, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "John Harrow is not a suspect. He is a man who has fulfilled a duty most would never understand." Clark's words hung in the air as she began to explain, her tone careful, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Decades ago," she said, "John Harrow had served in a covert unit during the Cold War, a shadow group that operated at the intersection of military and intelligence agencies. Known only to a select few, this unit, referred to in classified circles as Task Force Sentinel, had been tasked with gathering critical intelligence on foreign threats, securing sensitive assets, and, in some cases, ensuring certain truths never reached the public. Their missions were never recorded in official archives, their existence buried under layers of bureaucracy. The metal case, Clark continued, contained the last remnants of a long-forgotten operation called Project Emberwatch, a mission that had aimed to expose a network of espionage threatening national security. The documents, photographs, and device inside were meant for a Senate Intelligence Subcommittee, but the operation had unraveled in 1972 after a catastrophic betrayal. Most of the unit was lost, and the project was shut down, its records sealed, its evidence ordered destroyed. John, Clark revealed, had been one of the few survivors. In the chaos of the mission's collapse, he had been entrusted with the case by his closest friend, a fellow operative named Thomas Kane, who died ensuring John escaped with the evidence. Kane's final request was simple but profound: protect the truth until the time was right to deliver it to the proper authorities. John had made a promise, one he carried through decades of silence, living quietly in Caldwell, blending into the town's rhythm while guarding a secret that could have reshaped history. The clearance to deliver the case had come only weeks ago, triggered by a declassification protocol so obscure it had taken years to navigate the federal labyrinth. That night, John had set out to fulfill his vow, driving through the rain to hand over the case to the FBI, knowing it would likely lead to his detention. He expected this, Clark said, glancing at John with a nod of respect. He knew the system would flag him, and he was prepared to wait. The room was silent as the officers absorbed the weight of the story. Reyes, her eyes wide, looked at John, seeing not the quiet widower, but a man who had carried a burden heavier than any of them could imagine. Daniels, his earlier unease now replaced by awe, shifted in his seat, his gaze dropping to the case. Carter, the grizzled veteran, felt a pang of recognition, not for the specifics, but for the kind of loyalty that defined John's actions. John himself said nothing, his hands still folded, his face betraying no emotion. Yet when Clark mentioned Thomas Kane, a flicker crossed his eyes, brief but unmistakable, a glimpse of the grief and resolve that had driven him for half a century. Clark paused, letting the moment settle, then continued. The contents of this case confirm details of Project Emberwatch that were thought lost, she said. They will be reviewed at the highest levels, and Mr. Harrow's role will be acknowledged, quietly as he prefers. Clark turned to John, her voice softening. Are you ready? She asked. John nodded, rising slowly from his chair. The officers stood as well, an instinctive gesture of respect. Clark addressed Carter directly. Your team's cooperation has been exemplary, she said. You'll receive a formal follow-up from the Bureau, but for now, Mr. Harrow is free to go. Treat him as a protected individual under federal oversight. Carter nodded, his usual authority tempered by the surreal turn of events. Clark's escort lifted the case, and the group moved toward the hallway, John walking beside them, his steps steady despite the long night. As they passed, officers in the main office stood still, their faces a mix of curiosity and reverence. Daniels, catching John's eye, offered a small nod, a silent apology for the cuffs at the checkpoint. John returned it, a faint acknowledgement that needed no words. Outside, the mist had begun to lift, revealing a sky streaked with the first hints of dawn. The SUVs waited in their precise formation, their engines purring softly. The agents moved with the same quiet efficiency, some already seated, others scanning the lot. Clark paused at the station's entrance, turning to Carter. Thank you, Sergeant, she said, her tone formal but sincere. Your station handled this well. Carter nodded, unsure how to respond to a night that felt like it belonged to another world. John stepped into the drizzle, the faint light catching the lines on his face. He paused, turning back to glance at the station, his eyes lingering on the doorway where the officers stood watching. No one spoke, but the silence carried a shared understanding. An agent opened the door of the lead SUV, and John climbed in, his movements unhurried. The vehicles began to move, their headlights slicing through the fading mist, disappearing into the dawn as smoothly as they had arrived. Inside the station, the officers remained where they were, the hum of the fluorescent lights returning to prominence. No one reached for their paperwork or checked their phones. The night had left a mark, a story that would linger in their minds long after the shift ended. Carter sat at his desk, pulling out a notepad to jot down a brief report. He kept it simple. John Harrow released without charge after federal intervention. No aggression, full cooperation, left with FBI escort. He avoided mentioning the case or its contents, sensing that the truth was not his to record. As he wrote, he glanced at the security monitor, now showing an empty parking lot, the mist settling back into the asphalt. The station felt different now, as if it had been touched by something larger than itself. John Harrow, the quiet man who had walked among them for years, had carried a secret that changed everything. And in the silence of his departure, he had left behind a legacy of duty that no one in Caldwell would ever forget. As the last of the FBI SUVs vanished into the misty dawn, the Caldwell police station seemed to exhale, its walls settling back into their familiar quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, and the hum of the heater kicked in, a reminder of the ordinary world that now felt distant. The officers, still gathered in the main office, stood in a daze, their minds replaying the night's surreal events. Sergeant Carter leaned back in his chair, his notepad open but untouched, the weight of what had transpired too heavy for words. Officer Reyes sat at her desk, staring at the empty coffee cup in her hands, while Officer Daniels paced slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor. Officer Torres, the rookie, lingered near the security monitors, watching the empty parking lot as if expecting the SUVs to reappear. The metal case, John Harrow's cryptic calm, and the federal agent's swift takeover had left an indelible mark, turning a routine shift into a story that would be whispered about for years. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, leaving the air cool and still, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds to paint the wet asphalt gold. Carter finally broke the silence, his voice gruff but steady. "All right, everyone, let's get back to it. Shift's not over." The words were meant to ground them, to pull the station back to its usual rhythm, but they fell flat. Reyes nodded absently, flipping open a report she had no intention of reading. Daniel stopped pacing, leaning against a wall with a sigh. Torres hesitated, then spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarge, what do we even put in the log for this?" Carter looked at him, his expression softening. "The truth, as much as we know," he said. "Harrow was detained, feds took over, he was released. That's it." Torres nodded, but the simplicity of the answer didn't ease the questions swirling in his mind. None of them could shake the feeling that they'd brushed against something monumental, a secret that had lived in their town for decades, hidden in plain sight behind John Harrow's quiet demeanor. In the days that followed, Caldwell returned to its sleepy routine, but the night at the station lingered like a half-remembered dream. Whispers spread among the locals, fueled by the sight of the unmarked SUVs and the brief presence of federal agents. Some said John had been a government operative. Others claimed it was a mix-up, a case of mistaken identity. A local newspaper ran a short piece about federal activity at the station, but the story was vague, buried on page 3, and forgotten by the next week. The officers, bound by Agent Clark's instructions, said little, though their silence only deepened the town's curiosity. At the station, Carter filed his report, keeping it as minimal as he'd promised. John Harrow detained briefly, released without charge after federal intervention. Cooperated fully, no further action required. He sealed the file, knowing it would raise more questions than it answered. But that was the point. The truth, whatever it was, belonged to John in the bureau now. John himself did not return to town immediately. His modest house at the edge of Caldwell remained dark, the front porch empty, the old Dodge truck absent from its usual spot. Neighbors noticed, their conversations tinged with speculation. "Heard he got arrested," one said over coffee at the diner. "Nah, saw those black cars. Bet he was some kind of spy," another replied. Most dismissed the rumors as small-town gossip, but a few began to look at John's quiet life differently, wondering what else they'd missed. A week passed before the familiar rumble of the Dodge broke the morning stillness. Just after sunrise, John drove into town, his truck moving at its usual, unhurried pace. The same route he'd taken for years. He parked outside the small grocery store, stepped out, and walked inside, his steps as steady as ever. The cashier, a young man named Ethan who'd heard the whispers, watched him closely. John picked up his usual items, coffee, a loaf of bread, a few cans, and paid with exact change. "Morning," he said, his voice low but polite. Ethan nodded, searching John's face for some hint of the rumors, but found only the same quiet man he'd always known. John left without another word, the bell above the door jingling softly behind him. Back at his house, John set the groceries on the kitchen table, the familiar routine grounding him after the upheaval of that night. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam rising in lazy curls, and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was crisp, the sky a clear blue, the weight of the rain-soaked night replaced by a quiet calm. He sat in his weathered chair, sipping slowly, his eyes tracing the road that stretched beyond his property. For the first time in decades, the burden he'd carried was gone. The metal case, the promise to Thomas Kane, the years of waiting, all of it had been fulfilled. There were no headlines, no ceremonies, no recognition beyond the nod from Agent Clark and the sealed case now in federal hands. But John had never sought a claim. His duty had been to the truth, to the friend who'd entrusted him with it, and to the silent vow that had shaped his life. As he sat, the world felt lighter. The road before him no longer a reminder of what he carried, but a path to a quieter existence. That Sunday, a black sedan with government plates pulled into John's driveway, its arrival unnoticed by most of the town. A woman in plain clothes stepped out, holding a small wooden box. John met her at the door, his expression as calm as ever. She handed him the box with both hands, her voice low. "This is for you," she said. "From the director. Your delivery ensured the truth came to light. Thomas Kane's name will be remembered, and so will yours." Inside the box was a folded flag, a letter on official letterhead, and a faded photograph of Kane in uniform, his smile frozen in time. The letter was brief, its words simple but heavy. "Your service has honored a legacy. The nation owes you a debt it can never repay." John held the box for a moment, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood, then nodded. The woman left without another word, the sedan disappearing down the road. John closed the door, placing the box on a shelf above his fireplace, where it joined a few other mementos, a worn dog tag, a small brass compass, relics of a life few knew. Life in Caldwell moved on, as small towns do. John resumed his routines, driving his truck, waving to neighbors, sitting on his porch with his coffee. But something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Neighbors greeted him with a touch more warmth, their nods carrying a quiet respect. The cashier at the grocery store no longer stared, instead offering a genuine smile. Even the officers at the station, when they saw John in town, gave him a nod from across the street, a silent acknowledgement of the night that had changed them all. John never spoke of what happened, never hinted at the case or the promise that had defined him. He didn't need to. The truth lived in the wooden box above his fireplace, in the letter he read only once, in the photograph of a friend whose name would not be forgotten. Every now and then, John would glance at the box, then out at the road, and sit a little straighter in his chair. The night John Harrow walked into the station with a locked metal case had not been about glory or retribution. It had been about a promise made in the shadow of loss, a vow kept through decades of silence. For John, that was enough. The world beyond Caldwell churned with its endless noise. But in his quiet house at the town's edge, peace had settled, not in words but in the stillness of a mission complete. The road stretched on, as it always had, but now it led to rest, to a life unburdened by the weight of secrets. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. Where are you reading from? And don't forget to stay tuned. Tomorrow we have another tale of hidden heroes waiting to be told.